Carl Jung unearthed something deeply disturbing about the genesis of narcissism. The most fundamental message that forges a narcissistic structure is never spoken aloud. It's never explicitly verbalized. It doesn't originate from obvious toxic phrases or outright abuse. It stems from something far more insidious, far more devastating. It originates from the parent's unconscious, and it's transmitted directly into the child's unconscious through a phenomenon Jung termed mystical participation, also understood as unconscious entanglement. Between the ages of 0 and 7, a child lacks psychological separation from their parents. There isn't yet a self distinct from the other. The child's psyche and the parental psyche are fused, and within this fusion, everything residing in the parent's unconscious, all the unresolved complexes, all the unintegrated shadow aspects, all the unhealed wounds, all the unrealized dreams, is absorbed by the child, not as external information, but as internal truth, as if it were inherently their own. And the fundamental message that's almost invariably conveyed is this: you do not exist to be yourself. You exist to heal my wounds, to complete my life, to become what I could never be. And from this invisible message, this unconscious psychic contamination, emerges narcissism, not as a choice, but as the desperate only possible means of survival within that dynamic. Over the next few minutes, you'll witness how mystical participation, or unconscious entanglement, functions in practice. How parents transmit unresolved complexes to their children without uttering a single word. How this transmission creates the foundational narcissistic structure that governs an entire adult life. How to recognize if you are carrying complexes that aren't even yours, but were absorbed from your parents. And more importantly, what Jung discovered about how to psychologically separate, finally, decades later. Because if you feel that your entire life has been lived for someone else, that you've never been permitted to be who you truly are, that you bear an melancholic, emotional weight you can't trace back to its source, this video will name something that's been operating for decades unnoticed. The fundamental, unconscious message that has shaped everything. Mystical participation, or unconscious entanglement, is a concept Jung borrowed from anthropology. Originally, it described how primitive tribes lived in psychological fusion with nature and with the group, with no clear demarcation between self and other. And Jung realized that young children inhabit this same state. There's no consolidated ego yet, no capacity to differentiate. This is mine versus that belongs to someone else. Everything is absorbed as one's own. And what's absorbed first and most profoundly is the emotional and psychological state of the parents. Their fears, their anxieties, their shames, their repressed desires, their unprocessed angers, and most devastatingly, their autonomous complexes. Because Jung discovered that complexes are like secondary personalities within the psyche. They possess a life of their own, thoughts of their own, emotions of their own, and they operate automatically, outside of conscious control. And when parents harbor unresolved complexes, these complexes don't remain confined within them. They leak, they contaminate the emotional atmosphere of the home. And the child, existing in mystical participation, or unconscious entanglement, absorbs these complexes, not as an external element that can be rejected, but as an integral part of their own psyche, as if they'd always been there. Allow me to illustrate how this manifests through a case Jung examined. I'll refer to him as Ethan. For as long as Ethan can remember, he's been burdened with chronic anxiety regarding money. It's immaterial how much he has in his accounts. It's immaterial that he's objectively financially stable. There's fearful, always the lurking terror that everything will collapse, that he'll lose it all, that he won't be able to survive. and this terror dictates entire life decisions. He works compulsively, sacrifices relationships for financial security, accumulates wealth but never feels secure, and lives with constant guilt, as if he owes something, as if he doesn't deserve rest, as if relaxing is fearful. At 38, during Jungian analysis, Ethan began to investigate the origins of this complex, and he uncovered something shocking. It wasn't his, it was his dad's. Ethan's dad grew up in extreme poverty, endured hunger during his childhood, experienced the humiliation of lacking, and developed a scarcity complex, a profound and automated anxiety about money. But he never emotionally processed this wound, never healed. He merely compensated, worked obsessively, accumulated wealth, and, unconsciously, without ever explicitly discussing it, transmitted the entire complex to Ethan. And here's what's absolutely critical to grasp. The dad never told Ethan that money was to be feared, never spoke of the poverty of his childhood. In fact, he provided well financially, gave Ethan everything he needed materially. But the complex doesn't require words to be transmitted. It transmits through the unconscious, through the tension in the dad's body when the topic of money arose, through the anxiety that permeated the house when bills arrived, through the dad's inability to relax, to enjoy, to be present. And Ethan, existing in mystical participation from ages 0 to 7, absorbed everything. The dad's complex took root in Ethan's psyche and began to operate automatically, as if it were his own, as if the dad's experience of poverty was Ethan's memory. Jung would term this psychic inheritance. You don't inherit only genes, you inherit complexes, wounds, fears, and the majority of individuals live their entire lives dominated by inherited complexes without ever realizing they aren't their own. But hold on, because the next level is even more disgusting. The inherited complex doesn't only create anxiety, it creates narcissism. And here's how. Ethan grew up with a clear, unconscious message. His function isn't to be himself. His function is to ensure financial security, to compensate for his dad's wound, to prove that the family escaped poverty. And to fulfill this function, Ethan developed a false, performative self, a self obsessed with success, with accumulation, with proving worth through financial achievements. And he buried the true self, the one who wanted to be an artist, who valued connection more than money, who needed space to create. All of that was relegated to the shadow because it didn't serve the unconscious function. It didn't heal his dad's wound. And the narcissistic structure emerged. Not overt grandiosity, but covert narcissism, compulsive workaholism, inability to relax, superficial relationships, because deep connection would demand vulnerability, and vulnerability would demand ceasing to perform, and ceasing to perform would signify failing in the unconscious function, disappointing his dad, confirming the primal terror of scarcity. So, Ethan lived 38 entire years, not for himself, but to heal a wound that wasn't even his, to complete a mission that was installed before he possessed the language to question it. And he called this his personality, his way of being, when it was an inherited complex, running automatically. And that's what Jung wanted you to understand about the generational transmission of narcissism. The root cause isn't what parents do consciously, it's what they are unconsciously, the unresolved complexes they carry, the unintegrated shadows, the unhealed wounds. And unless parents confront their own unconscious, they automatically contaminate their children, not out of malice, not by choice, but because mystical participation, unconscious entanglement, doesn't distinguish between psyches. What's in one leaks into the other. And the child, without psychological defenses, without the capacity for separation, absorbs everything and spends decades living someone else's life, fulfilling an unconscious function that was never questioned. Now, let me show you the most common types of unconscious messages that create narcissism, because recognizing the message you absorbed is the hopeful step toward freeing yourself from it. First unconscious message: you exist to validate me. Parents with unresolved inadequacy complexes have an unconscious need for constant validation, and they use their children for it. Not consciously, but the message is transmitted. Your worth depends on making me feel valuable. Your achievements exist for me to be proud of. Your success proves that I'm a good dad or a good mom. And the child internalizes it, develops a compulsive need to achieve, to be special, to prove their worth, not for themselves, but to validate their parent. And they live entire decades performing, never asking what they want, just fulfilling the unconscious function of parental validation. Second unconscious message: you exist to heal my loneliness. Parents who were emotionally abandoned in their own childhood develop a chronic emptiness and unconsciously expect their children to fill it. The message transmitted is, your function is to keep me company, to complete me emotionally, to be what my partner isn't. And the child internalizes it, develops emotional parentification, takes care of the parent's feelings, never has permission to be a child, and carries into adulthood an inability to have their own needs, because they were trained through unconscious entanglement that their needs are secondary, that their function is to take care of the other person, and they live in relationships where they get lost, where they disappear, because that's what they were programmed to do. Third unconscious message: you exist to fulfill my dreams. Parents with unfulfilled dreams unconsciously project onto their children. They wanted to be doctors but couldn't. They wanted to be artists but were prevented. They wanted to travel but didn't have the opportunity. And the unconscious message transmitted is, your life isn't yours. It's a continuation of mine. You're going to achieve what I couldn't. And the child internalizes it, follows a career they didn't choose, lives a life that isn't theirs, and feels a profound emptiness because they're living someone else's dream, fulfilling the unconscious function of parental compensation. And they develop narcissism, a false self inflated over achievements that mean nothing internally, or a false self collapsed over failure to realize a dream that was never theirs. Fourth unconscious message: you exist to prove that I'm not my dad. Parents who were wounded by their own parents develop an unconscious need to prove that they're different, and they use their children as evidence. The message transmitted is, you need to be happy to prove that I didn't repeat the mistakes. You need to be okay to validate my effort to break the cycle. And the child internalizes it. Can't have problems, can't suffer, can't show wounds, because that would confirm that the parent failed. So they develop a mask of perfection, a false self performatively happy, and buries all the pain in the shadow, living decades without permission to be human, because their unconscious function is to prove parental success. Fifth unconscious message: you exist to save me. Parents who feel like failures or trapped in their own lives project salvation onto their children. The unconscious message is, you're going to rescue me from this marriage. You're going to give meaning to my empty life. You're going to complete me. And the child internalizes an impossible weight, responsibility for the parent's happiness, and develops a savior complex. Can't say no, can't have boundaries, sacrifices themselves compulsively, because they were programmed through mystical participation that their function is to save the other person. And they live codependent relationships, attracting people who need to be saved, repeating an unconscious pattern installed in childhood. never asking who's going to save them. Sixth unconscious message: you exist to carry my shadow. Parents who don't integrate their own shadow project it onto their children. Everything they deny in themselves, they see in their child, and they attack. If the dad repressed anger, he sees his son as aggressive. If the mom repressed sexuality, she sees her daughter as promiscuous. The unconscious message is, you're what I can't be. You carry what I deny. And the child internalizes identification with the parental shadow, becomes really what was projected, or develops a fearful terror of becoming it, and lives fragmented, part of them identified with the projection, part of them fighting against it. Narcissism emerges as a desperate attempt to prove they're not what they were labeled, or as a total embrace of the label as identity. And here's what makes this so devastating. These messages were never spoken. They were never made explicit. So you can't point and say, that's what hurt me, because there's no that. There's just a vague sensation, an unexplainable weight, a function you fulfill without knowing why. And when someone asks why you live like this, you don't know how to answer. You say it's just your way, your personality, when it's an inherited, complex, controlling everything. Let me show you how to recognize if you're living in unresolved, unconscious entanglement decades later, because most people don't realize it. First sign: you can't make important decisions without consulting your parents. Not because you respect their opinion, but because you don't have access to what you want separate from what they want. The psychic fusion is still active. Yourself and their self aren't separated. So every decision is contaminated by their expectations, by their needs, by their fears. And you call this being a close family, valuing your parents' opinion, when it's unresolved unconscious entanglement preventing individuation. Second sign: you feel intense guilt when you do something different from what your parents would do. Not rational guilt, but visceral guilt, terror, as if you're betraying them. And this terror isn't about moral values, it's about psychic separation. Because when you were fused with them in childhood, differentiation meant death. It meant losing the connection essential for survival, and that terror got engraved. So decades later, every time you individuate, every time you choose to be yourself instead of an extension of them, the primal terror is activated, and you recoil. You go back to fusion, to the safety of not existing separately. And you call this family loyalty, respect, when it's unresolved unconscious entanglement keeping you imprisoned. Third sign: you instantly absorb your parents' emotional state. Even from a distance, the phone rings, it's mom, and before you even answer, you already feel what she's feeling: anxiety, sadness, anger. And you absorb it as if it were your own. There's no filter, no separation. What's inside her leaks into you and contaminates your entire day, your mood, your energy. And you think it's empathy, that you're being a good son or daughter, when it's actually mystical participation, unconscious entanglement, a psychic fusion that was sadly never truly separated. You're still functioning like a 3-year-old with no boundaries between your psyche and theirs. Fourth sign: you automatically repeat phrases your parents used to say, not because you agree with them, but because they're engraved in your unconscious. A situation arises and you react exactly as your dad would. You say exactly what your mom would say, and it startles you because consciously you don't want to be like them. But unconsciously, you're possessed by their complexes, and Jung would call this unconscious identification. You haven't psychologically separated, so their patterns run through you as if they were your own, and you spend years fighting against something inside of you, when what you really need is to recognize, hopeful, this isn't mine, it belongs to them, and to separate. Fifth sign: your life revolves around their approval. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter what you've accomplished. There's always a need for parental validation. And when it doesn't come, you fall apart because your sense of self-worth is still fused with their perception of you. You haven't developed an internal center of value, separate, autonomous, so you depend on external validation to know if you're adequate, if you have value, if you deserve to exist. And this is mystical participation, unconscious entanglement. You still need them to know who you are, because you've never psychologically separated, never individuated. And finally, the sixth sign, you don't know who you are apart from your family history. Someone asks you who you are, and you describe your family, the role you play, the function you fulfill, but you can't say who you are essentially, independent of them, because there was never any separation. You're an extension, a continuation, not a separate individual. And Jung would say that this is the opposite of individuation. It's living your entire life in mystical participation, unconscious entanglement, fused, never psychologically being born as yourself. But let me show you what happened when Ethan finally confronted this truth, because this moment reveals something essential about how to break free from mystical participation decades later in Jungian analysis. His therapist asked Ethan to do an exercise, to write a letter to his dad, not to send, but to externalize what was unconscious. And Ethan wrote, "Dad, I've spent 38 years living your life, carrying your fear, fulfilling your mission, and I've completely lost myself. I don't know who I am separate from you. I don't know what I want separate from what I absorbed that you needed. And I'm tired of performing, tired of compensating for a wound that isn't mine. Tired of proving that we escaped poverty when you already proved that by yourself. I need to live my life, not a continuation of yours." And as he wrote, Ethan began to cry. Not tears of sadness, tears of happiness, of hopefully finally naming something that had been operating for decades without a name. The unconscious function, the mystical participation that was never separated, the dad complex running inside him as if it were his own. And Jung would say that this moment, this recognition, is the beginning of psychological separation, because mystical participation doesn't automatically end at age 7. It continues, unconsciously, until it's consciously confronted. And most people never confront it. They live their entire lives fused with their parents' psyche, fulfilling unconscious functions, carrying inherited complexes. And when they hopefully recognize it, when they hopefully name it, separation becomes possible. Not easy, but hopeful. Ethan began to make different choices, small betrayals of the unconscious function. He took a vacation for the first time in 10 years, even with money to spare. And he watched the anxiety arise, the complex screaming that relaxing is dangerous. But this time, he recognized, that's not my voice, it's my dad's. It's his complex that I absorbed. And he consciously chose not to obey. He stayed on vacation, tolerated the anxiety, and discovered that on the other side, there was no catastrophe. There was only freedom. And freedom has a specific taste, the taste of existing as yourself for the first time. Ethan describes it as the sensation of finally breathing after decades of holding his breath, of finally resting after decades in hypervigilance, of finally feeling that his life is his, not an extension of his dad's life, not compensation for his dad's wound, not proof that the family escaped poverty, but his life, his choices, his mistakes and successes. And that sensation of belonging to himself is what Jung called individuation. Not becoming perfect, not eliminating the influence of your parents, but recognizing where you end and they begin, and consciously choosing who you want to be, separate from the unconscious messages installed decades ago. He started painting again, something he loved in adolescence, but abandoned because it didn't serve the function of financial security. And each brushstroke was an act of individuation, of separation from mystical participation, of rescuing the hopeful true self buried for decades. He didn't paint well, It didn't matter. It wasn't about the result. It was about doing something just because he wanted to, not because it served a function, not because it validated his dad, not because it proved his worth, but because it brought him happy. And joy without a function is a luxury he never allowed himself, because he was programmed that joy needs to be earned, deserved, justified, when joy simply exists as a human right, not as a reward for fulfilling an unconscious function. And most transformative of all, he began to have different conversations with his dad, not accusatory, but gentle. "Dad, I realized that I absorbed your fear about money, and I've spent decades living as if it were my own. But it's not, and I need to separate myself from that. I need to discover who I am without that complex." And something unexpected happened. His dad started to cry, and he said something Ethan had, surprised, never heard before. "I know. I always knew I was passing this on to you, but I didn't know how to stop, and I'm sorry." And in that moment, the mystical participation began to dissolve, because it was brought to consciousness, it was named, it was recognized by both of them. And when the unconscious becomes conscious, it loses its power.
The complex still exists, but it no longer controls automatically. It can be consciously chosen or consciously rejected. And Ethan, for the first time in 38 years, had a choice. You've just seen something that few videos about narcissism reveal: how the root cause doesn't come from obvious words or actions, but from unconscious transmission through mystical participation. How unresolved parental complexes contaminate the child's psyche and create a narcissistic structure. How messages never spoken mold an entire life. And understanding and naming those messages is the hopeful first step towards psychological separation and individuation. This information is rare because it demands a deep Jungian understanding of mystical participation, autonomous complexes, and generational transmission. Few channels dive to this level of depth. Each video like this represents hours of studying dense Jungian concepts and translating them into accessible language. If this video named an unconscious message that you absorbed, if it helped you recognize that you're living out a role that isn't yours, if it opened up the possibility of psychological separation for the first time, the super thanks button down below is more than financial support. It's you saying that this truth about the unconscious formation of narcissism needs to continue being revealed, that other people need to understand that they're carrying complexes that aren't even theirs. When you support this work, you're bringing to light something that families have kept unconscious for generations and allowing more content like this to be created. You're not just a spectator. You're a survivor seeking psychological separation, and each act of support helps others recognize the invisible messages that control everything. And here's the serious ultimate truth about mystical participation that Carl Jung wanted you to understand. Psychological separation doesn't mean rejecting your parents. It doesn't mean blaming them or hating them. It means recognizing where you end and they begin. It means distinguishing between what is yours and what was absorbed. It means having compassion for their limitations while freeing yourself from the unconscious role they installed. Because your dad and mom also lived in mystical participation with their parents. They also absorbed complexes. They also fulfilled unconscious roles. They were also never seen as separate individuals. And they transmitted this because they never confronted it in themselves. So, when you do the work of separation, when you bring to hopeful consciousness what was unconscious, when you individuate, you're not just freeing yourself. You're breaking a cycle that's probably been going on for generations. You're healing not only yourself, but your energetic lineage, past and future. Because when you stop fulfilling an unconscious role, your children don't absorb that role. When you confront your complexes, your children don't inherit those complexes.
When you separate psychologically, you create space for them to be themselves, without invisible missions, without unspoken roles, without mystical participation that devours individuality. And that is individuation in the deepest sense that Jung conceived. Not becoming perfect, not eliminating all wounds, but becoming conscious, separated, whole, yourself. And when you achieve that, when you happily live your life instead of the life you were programmed to live, something profound happens. You feel, for the first time, that you exist. Not as a function, not as an extension, but as an individual. And that sensation of existing as yourself, of having permission to be who you are, of living a life that is yours, is what makes the entire process of psychological separation worthwhile. It's freedom in the deepest sense. And it's available now, through recognizing the unconscious message, naming the inherited complex, and making a conscious choice repeatedly to live differently. What unconscious message did you absorb from your parents that was never spoken in words? Comment with a sentence that captures that message. And if you recognize that you've been living in mystical participation for decades, write separation in the comments. All know that this theme of individuation and psychological separation needs to be explored further.